Melody, the first thing you said to me is that you've been getting a lot of TikToks for tubal ligation.
Yeah, and also moving to Ireland, in addition to just like all of the other processing.
Ugh. Welcome to the first culture study podcast post-election. I'm very glad that we didn't have anything come out last week.
Can you
Nothing would have
imagine?
felt appropriate,
No.
but we are happy to be here. And actually, this is a perfect episode that I think this is the sort of nuance that I always crave when talking about something as complicated as gender in sports. And this is the sort of nuance that I think a lot of people really reject. And I love this episode. It's fantastic. And I'm really grateful for all of our listeners who are also willing to lean into the complication. So we're really happy you're here. Okay. Women's sports have never been more popular. And there's also like seemingly endless public hand wringing and outright panic about who should be able to participate in women's sports. So, Rose, are these two things connected?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that, if you can ignore women's sports because there's no money in it, there's no fame in it, there's no cultural power in it, then it doesn't matter who competes. But as soon as that stops being the case, and as soon as you have women athletes, female athletes being incredibly culturally powerful and relevant and rich and have all these brand deals and moving the culture forward, all of a sudden it really matters who gets to compete and who doesn't.
Right. Well, and this actually, I was thinking about the Olympics and how very few people outside of when it's Olympics time care about people who participate in so many different types of sports. And then suddenly, when the Olympics come into the foreground and it's an opportunity for celebrity, like it's just this time when you can actually be someone in the public eye and wield some power, then suddenly we care about who's competing in, say, women's boxing.
It is amazing how many people are experts in women's boxing, and I just had no idea there were so many women's boxing experts out there. It's just truly incredible to me.
This is the Culture Study Podcast, and I'm Anne Helen Peterson.
I'm Rose Eveleth, the host of Tested, the podcast. Different podcast, not this podcast, different one.
This is a great tee up for us to talk about Tested, which came out in July alongside the Olympics. So how are you thinking in terms of like, I want to create this podcast? When are we going to release it? What's the perfect time? Like, how are you thinking there?
I would love to say that this was like totally planned out and extremely strategic. What is the truth is that I have been working on this series for 10 years. I pitched it for 8 years.
Wow.
I pitched it 26 places until the CBC, Canadian Broadcast Company, said yes. And then NPR eventually came on. And that didn't happen until October of last year. And then it was like, oh, well, I guess we're doing this for the Olympics. Like it is good timing, right? It is the right, perfect time to do it. But it was sort of all of a sudden it went from me spending years, funding this on my own, spending all of my savings to try and make this to, oh my God, we have 6 months basically to make a huge documentary podcast series that would normally take 12 months to make. But it just there was no universe in which we were putting this out after. It had to be right when the Olympics were happening. And so I think, it was good timing and also stressful timing for me personally.
So just for listeners who aren't familiar, because I know we have a lot of listeners who have listened to the show and love it, can you sketch out what the show is and also what made you think that this could be a show and would be a show that would be important 10 years ago?
Yeah, so Tested is about the sort of past, present, and future of so-called gender verification policies in elite sports. And those are policies that basically say that there is some test that we have to do to make sure that the women competing in women's sports are really female or really women. And there's been this very long history of trying to find this test. It goes all the way back to the very beginning of women's competition in the Olympics. And for me, I think being able to trace that long history really puts today's conversation in a totally new context. Because once you realize that this is not a new conversation, that we have been doing this for almost 100 years, it really takes on a different tone. I got really obsessed with this story when I was an intern in 2012 at Scientific American. And when you're an intern, you do literally whatever anyone asks you to do. And I was reporting on prosthetic devices, actually, like really high end, like cheetah blades and the bionic arms and all of that. And I wrote this, one of my first ever feature stories, which is very exciting, about this debate about a different athlete, an athlete named Oscar Pistorius, who at the time was very famous for being the sort of blade runner. He runs on 2 cheetah prosthetic blades. Unfortunately, now he is probably better known for being in prison for murdering his girlfriend. But at the time that had not happened. And he was sort of the center of this debate because there was this argument. He wanted to race in the Olympics. He didn't want to race in the Paralympics. He wanted to race in the Olympics. And there was this debate happening among officials and scientists about whether or not he had an unfair advantage because he had these 2 cheetah blades. And I remember just thinking that was really fascinating, right? What does it mean to have an unfair advantage in sports? I'm a huge sports guy. I used to run. I love watching sports. I follow sports. And I mean, like, all athletes have unfair advantages, right? Like, elite athletes are, and I say this with great fondness, like freaks of nature, right? That's just like what is happening when we watch the Olympics.
Yeah.
And so this idea of like, what's going on there. And as I was researching that, I came across Caster Semenya, who I had heard about when she broke out into the world stage in 2009. And I had sort of heard about this whole story, but honestly was very confused by it. And so I just sort of was like, I don't know what's going on there. And then when I re-encountered it, this woman who raced in 2009, sort of had this incredible race on the world stage, won the world championships in Berlin that year, and immediately was sort of thrust into this nightmare of people saying, that's not really a woman. We need to test her. They did test her. Her, medical results are leaked. And just from there, this big conversation about who really is a woman. And when I started reading these archival news articles and studies about this, it just struck me as like one of those moments, when you encounter something and you're just like, what are we talking? Like, what does that mean? Like, what does that actually mean when you say, oh yeah, she is a woman, but maybe not 100%? Like, what are we talking about? Like, what does that actually mean? And so I just got obsessed since then. And I've spent many years now deep in on this, and I feel like you approach things similarly, where once you get hooked on something, you just like cannot stop. You just end up,
when you look
deep in.
And then you go in deep into history, and you're like, oh, 100 years ago, like, I wonder why people had anxiety about women in sports in that moment, right?
Right. Like, and then suddenly you're like in Lausanne at the IOC archives, like trying to find like 100-year-old letter, right? Like, you just can't, I just could not stop myself. And so here we are, and now Tested exists, which is very exciting.
Can you spell out for listeners a little bit why there would have been so much anxiety about women in the public sphere 100 years ago, and specifically in sports?
Yeah, so the Olympics were made by men for men, right? The idea of women competing in the Olympics was just, it wasn't even something they were against. It was something they did not even consider, right? Like, it was not even on their, they weren't like opposed to it. It was truly not a thought they ever had one time. And so, but of course, from the very beginning, women are saying, hey, I want to compete. Like, I want to run. I want to swim. I want to play tennis. I want to do all this stuff. And the founder of the modern Olympics, Pierre de Coubertin, was appalled by this idea that women would want to do this thing, in part because the Olympics were founded largely as a way to encourage a certain kind of manliness, right? A certain kind of masculine athleticism. And those two words are sort of synonyms, right? Like, this idea of athleticism was not something that women were supposed to aspire to, in any way. And so, of course, as is always the case, immediately women are saying, hey, I actually want to do that too. And in fact, I'm kind of good at it, and I would like to compete. And there's a long sort of and really fascinating back and forth that happens about how to include women in the Olympics, whether to include women in the Olympics. There are 2 books that I highly recommend. One is by Michael Waters called The Other Olympians, and the other is Maggie Merton's book, Better, Faster, Stronger, which sort of both sort of trace in some ways the early history of women's inclusion in sports. And eventually they do win the ability to compete. First, they get, the ladylike sports, like tennis, which is very funny to me to consider that ladylike, because at the time they were wearing corsets, and they were literally taking off their corsets after these matches and they're bloody because they're playing tennis in a corset. So like the idea that that's like this feminine, like delicate thing that people are doing is wild. But eventually, 1928, they get to compete on the track. And this is just absolutely horrifying to the men who are watching, because when you run really hard, your face makes weird shapes. You look like you're exerting yourself. You're doing all these physical things that to the men of the time, many of them were just disgusting. And they were fairly vocal about how disgusting they found it. And so that just felt so like it was so antithetical to what they believed real womanness and like femininity was, that they sort of freaked out a little bit.
Yeah. No, and I think even just like articulating that very like basic coding that athleticism is masculine, and if you are athletic in some capacity, and if your body is good at being athletic, if your body is built in a way that codes it as athletic, then you are also masculine. And of course, this intersects with all of these understandings about whiteness and race and all sorts of things. But that basic understanding guides so much of our thinking. And it's so, like, it's so wild to me that you're like, oh, like, of course, like, all of this panic is rooted in this thing that, like, is not, it's all cultural. Like, it's all understandings that we have mapped onto bodies. There's nothing fixed about it.
Totally. And it is, I mean, it's also so interesting to go back and read this, and you know, these men are not subtle, right? They're not trying to be, you know, like, oh, well, of course we support women. They're like, this is gross. Like, this is disgusting to me. Like, they just, they think it's ugly. They like talk about it, right? In this way that is very, you know, unabashed, right? Because that was the dominant thought, right? In the sort of powers that be. And the other thing that's probably worth noting is that these men who were in charge of the Olympics for many years, particularly at the beginning, these are the ultimate aristocrats. These are like kings and princes and barons and like titled nobility people who have, even for their own time, a fairly regressive idea about what gender roles might look like. And those are the people that are creating the Olympics.
There's just so many directions I could take this. But I think that we're going to cover a lot of the different ways that we could go with this. We're going to cover this as we answer listener questions. So let's get into our first question. Yeah. This comes from Jennifer, and Melody's going to read it for us.
Regarding gender issues in sports, what's up with the transphobia and panic? At the end of the day, it regards a very small population. When people are trying to ban an assigned male at birth kid who has transitioned to being a girl from running cross country in South Dakota, a whole state of people are focused on keeping one up to a handful of children from competing. It's a witch hunt.
Okay, so I watched this happen in Idaho too. I watch it happen and you actually really grapple with this in the podcast, this obsession with a hypothetical even, right? Because even if there is one actual case, the thing that people are mad about is this hypothetical army of people who will enter into a sport, whether it's women's sports or men's sports, but usually women's sport, and somehow screw everything up. Like, I love women's sports, and this is the problem, right? And I don't think these people actually love women's sports is also the problem. So when you hear this question, what direction does this lead you in?
Yeah, I think, you know, it's such a good question. And I think there are so many things that are happening all at once that kind of really are converging on sports, right? You have just the rise of transphobia generally in the world right now, which I think there are many reasons for, which, you know, probably a whole other podcast on that. Yeah. But I think that sports really allows for a kind of centralization and in some ways a bit of plausible deniability around transphobia, because it's one of the very few places still in our world that is pretty rigidly sex separated, right? You have sports, you have bathrooms, and prisons, right? And when you look at where people are freaking out about trans women, and it's always trans women, it's sports, bathrooms, and prisons, right? Because these are the places that are still very rigidly sex separated. I think, though, at the same time, if it was just that, I don't know that we'd be seeing it, but I think that what you see in sports is that you see this really convenient cover for transphobia in a lot of ways. Because you can say, you know, people say like, well, of course I'm not transphobic. Of course, like trans people, that's fine if you want to live your life that way or whatever thing they say. But sports is about fairness, right? And sports is about this other thing. And you can kind of couch a lot of what is at its core transphobia in things like this sort of very nebulous idea of fairness, whatever that means. And, fair to who is, I think, a good follow-up question to that. But also you can couch it in these alleged ideas around biology and around science and around sort of like, oh, but we know that testosterone does X, Y, and Z, and boys are bigger and this, that, and the other. And you get to kind of have a veneer of sort of logic and or sort of philosophy around what, again, at its core is really just trying to exclude people. And as you say, often children, right? These are children who are trying to just like run on their high school cross-country team or whatever it is. And I think also sports offers this place where it's not just, oh, we're letting trans people do what they want. It's that now there's a competition and there's a winner. And now all of a sudden, I think most people, aside from the most like virulent transphobes, can't really stomach saying out loud like that they don't think trans people should exist in the world. They should just like not exist at all. I mean, there are certainly people who believe that, but I think in general, most people, if they were forced to articulate that out loud, would be like, ooh, that feels not great. But as soon as someone, as soon as that trans person is potentially winning and taking something away from a cis person, then you get that kind of like, well, wait a minute, hold on. And you see the same thing around like these complaints around DEI or affirmative action, right? Like, of course, like people of color can blah, blah, blah. But as soon as they seem to be unfairly somehow getting something that a white person should get or that a cis person should get, now there's a problem, right? And I think you see all of those things coalescing in sports, and also, right, the fact that women's sports are big business now. That like, it used to be that whatever, women's high school sports, like who cares? But now, if you do well in high school, you do well in college, there's money to be made. There's power to be had there. And I think all of those things are kind of colliding and create this really dark place where, as you say, in South Dakota, you have a whole state trying to keep one girl from competing, which is just like, part of me is like, can y'all just like take a step back and like think about what you're doing here? But as you say, it is all really based on this hypothetical, this idea. And you see this throughout the history for years and years in the letters from the archives, that there is this real concern that on the case of, athletes with sex variations, you see people saying things, and this is in the 70s and 80s even, you see people saying things like, oh, coaches are going to go around the world and they're going to go find all these DSD athletes and they're going to train them up, and there's going to be this army of DSD athletes who are taking over the sport, and no real woman, quote unquote, will ever win again. And like, that's literally never happened. If it was these people are worried about this in the 70s. We've had enough time for that to potentially, if that were a thing that was going to happen, maybe happen. It has not. There's just a lot of, boogeymen and hypotheticals and theoreticals that like, trans women are going to win everything. And like, part of me is like, okay, well, how would that be the worst thing in the world? But also there's no evidence that that's even true. And so just this like invention of this hypothetical potential future in which certain women no longer get the accolades that they deserve, it really spins people up into all sorts of very strange places.
Can you define quickly what a DSD athlete is?
Oh, yes. So DSD is an acronym for differences of sex development. There's a lot of opinions out there around the best language to use here for athletes with sex variations. DSD is a medical term. There are some people who really dislike it because it medicalizes something that for many people is normal and fine and, is not a problem. DSD athlete is what World Athletics and what most sports federations call these athletes. They call them DSD athletes. Some of these athletes, although most don't, some of these athletes identify as intersex, which is sort of more a community term, a little bit more like queer, where you kind of opt into that. I tend to either use DSD athletes because that's what they often call themselves and also what the sports federations call them, or just athletes with sex variations. And so these are athletes who have some combination of variations in their sex biology. They might have XY chromosomes. They might have high testosterone. They might have XY chromosomes, but not high testosterone, right? There's all sorts of variations that happen in the body, but they can kind of be lumped into this general category of DSD.
I'll also direct listeners to your website. We'll put it in the show notes. You have a great glossary of terms, why you're using the terms, things that ended up on the cutting room floor, all sorts of links to research and further reading. Like, it is excellent.
Thank you.
I'm going to take us on a little bit of a detour, and Melody may or may not cut this, but I have this memory, vivid memory that has stuck with me from the Michael Jordan documentary, like the 5-part documentary. And they're talking about Scottie Pippen. And they're saying how when he showed up at college, he grew within the span of like 4 months, 5 months, 6 months. He grew like a foot. And as I was watching this, they don't say it explicitly on the show. They talk about how he grew up really poor. There were a lot of people in his family. His parents tried as hard as they could to provide as much as they could, but there wasn't enough food. And what happened when he got to college was essentially he had nutrition for the first time in his life. And the reason I'm telling this story is just because when I think about fairness.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yep.
When if we're trying to create conditions for fairness or even talk about fairness, as soon as you start poking that concept, it falls apart. Because if we want to talk about fairness, we have to talk about like all these other different components of equity that are not present. And what I think most people, especially in the case of like a high school kid trying to run track in South Dakota, are mad about is that if you can pay for something, then that's not inequitable, right? It's just like you tried harder. So of course your kid can have private coaching. That's not unfair. It's meritocracy, right?
Yeah,
like it's
totally.
all this like class and ability stuff intersecting. Where does that take you?
I think about this all the time because the women that I'm interviewing, not all of them, but most of them come from really rural areas and much like Scottie Pippen, did not have anything. And in some ways, far worse, right? So Christine Mboma, right, who's one of the main characters of the podcast, she grew up in a tiny village on the border of Angola in Namibia. And I went with her to her village, and these are still stick huts, right? These are people who do not have enough. They do not have enough. And in some ways, Christine's success has been hugely influential. She's building a grocery store in her village. She's building houses for her family. She single-handedly now is the breadwinner for her entire family, which is many people. And you go there and you watch, or, Max and Molly grew up running barefoot in Kenya, right? And you watch this, I get videos sometimes from coaches who have athletes who are impacted by this. And they send me these videos of their athletes training, no shoes, dirt, just the middle of nowhere, right? And for me, watching these videos and then to be told that this woman has an unfair advantage and she needs to be regulated. Meanwhile, you look at the USA track and field facility, and like it just doesn't compute, right? Like this idea of, fairness is always going to be an impossible thing to achieve, right? We can't, nothing can ever be totally fair. But to prioritize a certain kind of fairness, this biological, like hormonal fairness over some of these other much more impactful and obvious things, in my opinion, it just feels like it sort of gives away the game, right? It gives away that you're not really concerned about true fairness. What you're concerned about is this other thing that you've decided is actually, the thing that you can control. There's an interesting letter, I can't remember if it's meeting minutes or a letter from World Athletics archives where they talk about how they want to have, a complete biological parity. And unless you're like having a clone army compete, that's just not happening, right? That's not happening. And I think it is, right? Like it's very telling that there's been so much, frankly, money spent on lawyers and lobbyists and lawsuits to try and defend these policies that could have been spent giving people shoes, providing like food for people, giving people, medical resources, right? These are people I talked to who, before they became even moderately successful in track and field, couldn't tell me the last time they went to a doctor, don't have any of their vaccines, right? Don't have like all of these basic medical care that, we talk about that is sort of taken for granted in a lot of places for a lot of people isn't happening there. And so this idea that this is all in the name of fairness really does start to fall apart when you look at conditions and the ways in which some of these people are living who are allegedly, unfairly advantaged in some cases. And in other cases, Max and Molly, who you hear on the show, she told me she eats one meal a day and she's trying to train for the Olympics. I mean, that's not a sustainable, you're not going to be as successful because, you have to eat. Like that's a core part of training.
Right. Like what if they penalized people who had 3 meals a day? They're like, sorry.
Right.
Yeah, that's not fair.
Yeah, we're actually going to take away your fancy track. We're going to take away, like you would never do that, right?
Right.
And it's just I don't know. I feel like to me, it just really makes it so clear that this is a very selective kind of fairness that they care about.
This is a great tee up for our next question, which is about a different balance on fairness. This comes from Shelby.
Why is it that female athletes are tested for testosterone levels while male athletes are not given an equivalent test? Having high levels of estrogen isn't considered a competitive advantage. Once tested, women are then open to finding out identity-altering information, which then becomes public. Male to female is a spectrum, with many variations between XY and XX, but only women are subject to this kind of testing. Is that fair?
It's a great question. I get asked this a lot, which is like, why are men not tested, right? Why is it only women? And the answer that you get when you ask this question of the folks who are in favor of these rules is that the female category is protected, is the word that they use. The male category is not. The male category is considered an open, universal category, and the female category is protected. And the entire premise of women's sports, the reason that we have women's sports, a women's category, is because, obviously, men are inherently biologically better at sports, right? That if we did not have a women's category, women would never be able to compete, would never be able to win. And so if you're going to draw a line and you're going to say, okay, we have a women's category because otherwise y'all will just never win and never be able to be competitive, then you have to enforce that boundary, right? And you have to police that boundary. And that is sort of the underlying argument here that they make around why it is that there's no point. It doesn't matter. Men can have as much testosterone as they like, right? Men can have as long as they're not doping. If you just naturally have super high testosterone and you're a man, good for you. Congrats. Like, you get to go do your thing. The assumption is that estrogen would never in any situation be a competitive advantage, right? There's all of these assumptions about what it means to be athletically talented, what it means to be competitive. Sports were built and designed by men, and so they favor things that men are good at, right? And so in some ways, they're not wrong that if you just let everybody compete in one category, in most sports, women wouldn't be competitive, right? If you look at the track, like women are not running. I mean, even these women, which I think is important to point out, these women who are allegedly super unfairly advantaged, none of them have a world record in the women's category. Caster Semenya is the fourth fastest 800-meter runner in women's history. These women are not blowing their competitors out of the water. They are not running anywhere close to male times. Caster, at her fastest, would have been beaten by a middle school boy, right? And so, like, I mean, a very fast middle school boy, the fastest middle school boy in the United States, but still, we're not like, there is a gap, right? And I think that that's a thing that, you have to grapple with. And some of that is access. Some of that is encouragement of women's sports. That gap is closing in many situations. But I think there is some argument to be made that there should be categories. There should be some sort of separation here. So if you're going to separate, you need to have an enforcement. You need to have a line that you're enforcing. And I think that's what makes this so complicated and so hard for a lot of people because, right, like if you have committed to two categories, then you have to figure out a way to draw a line there. Now, I would argue that these women that we're talking about and also trans women are both satisfy the requirements of competing in the female category. But, other people would argue they haven't. And so that is why that is the argument that is made for why men are never tested, is because that is an open category. Now, I think there are many flaws in this argument, right? Obviously, but that is the core foundational reason why we don't test men for anything. So you could have men out there who have XX chromosomes who are competing in men's sports, and it wouldn't matter because the assumption is that, well, of course that wouldn't make them better, right? Because being a female is inherently worse. You're inherently worse at sports. If you're interested in the sort of testosterone angle of the ways in which like the ideas of testosterone as this like magical sporting, enhancement thing, there's a great book by Katrina Karkakis called Testosterone, an Unauthorized Biography, I think it is. And it is like mind blowing because you just hear some like incredibly hilarious history of like how people thought about the hormones, but also it just really goes through so many of the assumptions that we make about why men are allegedly better at sports than women and where that comes from and all of that.
It also reminds me of a friend of yours who you quote in a piece of writing that we'll get to in just a little bit, but this friend basically suggests like all of this thinking tells us that they think of being a woman as a disability.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and there's a lot of really incredible sort of like feminist scholars who've written about disability and feminism and the ways in which sort of like both the systems of oppression, right? Systems of assuming that one thing is the default, right? Like whiteness or able-bodiedness or, you know, maleness is the default and everything else is sort of a degradation from that norm or from that center. A lack.
Yeah.
Very much shows up here, right? It's very, and also I think there's the paternalism, right? Of like, oh, but women need to be protected, right? We need to make sure that we're protecting women. And, you know, when you talk to athletes, right? I interviewed a ton of athletes for this. Some of them, you know, didn't want to go on the record, but many of them said like, I don't need, that's not what I need protection from. I want protection from predatory coaches, right? I want protection from other things, but this is not a thing I need protecting from. And also, right, who are we protecting? We're certainly not protecting the women who are being impacted by these policies, right? And so it just sort of, again, goes back to like fairness for who? Protection for who?
Yeah. One thing that we got a question, we're not addressing it specifically, but we got a question from a trans person who identifies as non-binary, and they were just trying to figure out, like, I am at such a loss at how to sign up for events. And I've seen a lot of running events which now have a category for people who are non-binary or like want to not identify as either male or female, right? But I don't see it in a lot of other stuff too. And this person is trying to be really, really thoughtful. They're like, whose preference do I take into account here?
Yeah.
The other people? Mine? Right? Like, what do I do?
Yeah, it's. I mean, I'm non-binary also, and it's such a hard question, right? Because, you know, on the one hand, you know, you can really tie yourself up in knots, which I'm sure this person is doing, and I very much empathize with, because you're like, oh, but if I sign up for the women's event, am I like reinforcing ideas that like actually I'm really, you know, like you can really just like turn yourself into like a total Gordian knot, right?
Yes.
I think that I often look to Quinn, who is a non-binary soccer player on the Canadian national team, who's talked a little bit about this. And I think that so much of this, I mean, we're living in this imperfect system, and at some point, you know, you have to sort of figure out how you feel about it, and I can't tell anyone what to do, but I think so much of what I hope for this in terms of figuring out how to navigate that is that leagues and teams and sports groups, intramural, whatever it is, club, whatever, you know, instead of getting really tied into knots about like how they're going to define who plays on what side, really just trying to make both spaces as open and welcoming as possible. And so that you allow for the athlete to choose and it doesn't ever feel like there's a horrible wrong choice. And I think that has been, and the NWSL has done a really good job of that. WNBA has done a really good job of that, where, you know, there are some trans players in the WNBA who are non-binary or who, you know, don't identify as women, and the league has worked really hard to make that a space where they can be their full selves and their teams and practice and all of that. And I think that like that to me feels like the more important work than the like semantic wording of the policy, if that makes any sense. But it's tough. I empathize. I've been there.
This is a great way to talk about our last question, which comes from Moira.
Why are people up in arms about gender in the Olympics but not the Paralympics? There are sports that are gender segregated in the Olympics but not the Paralympics, and some Paralympic athletes who I was expecting to spark similar debates to Olympic athletes like Aman Khalif, but it didn't happen. Is it just that fewer people are paying attention to the Paralympics? Does it have to do with Paralympic divisions by ability?
So you wrote a newsletter or a blog post. I don't know. I saw it today.
It came out
this morning. It came out today. And we had this question yesterday. Like it was just such perfect timing. So the title of the post is "What Can We Learn from the Paralympics About the Future of Sports?" So let's table set for this question. What are some of the things? It's such a good post. I'm so excited to share it.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, this is I love this question. It's a great question. And I think like the first part of it, which is like, yes, in some ways there isn't as much panic because people still see the Paralympics as kind of a secondary, lesser event, right? Which is I mean, if you're a sports fan and you're not watching the Paralympics, like, I don't know what to tell you. Like, it is the greatest sporting event every 4 years. I am obsessed with it. I think it's incredible. There are sports that you would never see. There's goalball, there's blind soccer. It's like absolutely incredible. I'm a power lifter, and watching people who have no leg drive bench like 400 pounds is just like unreal, right? You know, you just like,
Totally.
it's so cool. And it's just like, it's great sports, right? Like, it's just good sports. I don't know.
Yeah.
Like, I just don't know why. Yeah, I feel like you're missing out. And so, but I do think that there is still this feeling of like, oh, that's like more of a consolation prize. Oh, that's more of a like, oh, it's so nice for you, or like whatever else. And this year, actually, there was a really great campaign that a lot of athletes were doing on social media where they were talking about how they were saying, I'm not participating in the Paralympics, I'm competing in the Paralympics, right? This idea that this is not just like a fun participation project, right? This is a competition, and these are elite athletes, right? And I think that, you know, I do think it's great that we're seeing a shift. I do think this year people took the Paralympics a lot more seriously than they have in the past. And I really hope that continues, because I think it's an incredible, awesome sporting event. So I do think some of it is just people saying like, well, whatever, who cares? There was a little bit of trans panic around, there's an Italian sprinter, Valentina Petrillo, who I believe is the first out trans athlete to compete in the Paralympics. And like J.K. Rowling, as she is wont to do, had her thoughts about it. But there was not nearly as much of the uproar as there was around like, you know, the boxers or anybody else. The other interesting thing is that there are not eligibility policies, at least in track and field, and I did not look up all the other sports, but I did look up track and field. They don't have a DSD policy for the Paralympics. Their policy says that if you are legally female, you compete in the female category. So they don't have this kind of testing. I think there's probably a couple reasons for that. One is, again, like there is the sort of less of a concern or a consideration. It doesn't feel as valuable to win a Paralympic medal to people. We sort of talked earlier about the ways in which, you know, once women's sports become really culturally powerful, all of a sudden now there's all this panic. And I think that we may see, if the Paralympics kind of is on that same trajectory, we may see a new kind of push for that. I also think that there has not been, as far as I know, and this doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't exist, but there has not been a very successful DSD athlete in the Paralympics. The way that like casters win in 2009, it's hard to overstate how much that just ignited this, and totally like sex testing had gone away at that point. There was no policy, and casters win just started this whole thing over again.
Right.
And so I think that if we see a super successful DSD athlete, or, you know, athlete with sex variation in the Paralympics, we may see, hopefully not, I hope not, but we may see a push to sort of standardize the rules across. If I'm World Athletics, it's not a great look to have different rules, because it does sort of signal that you don't care as much about winning in the Paralympics.
Right.
Not that I want them to extend their rules any further than they already do. But so there's a lot of, I think, that going on as well. But also, I think that the Paralympics does provide some super interesting ways of thinking about advantage, right? And thinking about categories and classifications. If you've watched the Paralympics, you know that there's a lot of classifications, right? You might see the same race raced 10 times for different reasons, right? You have 3 different visual impairment categories. You have all sorts of, you know, prosthetics, wheelchair. You have, you know, are you a sort of hemi, which means that like you have half of your body sort of is doesn't sort of function properly, or is it just one arm, right? You know, you see all sorts of different kinds of coding around what the level and type and severity of the impairment is. And there's all sorts of drama about who gets classified and what classification, and
how you can change classifications. And if you like are too good for your classification, they move you to another classification.
Exactly. And this is, I think, the best sort of parallel here, right? Which is that, you know, you see people sometimes who are there was a track and field, a sprinter, who was in one classification, and he broke the world record in Tokyo and basically got reclassified because they said, no, you're actually too fast to be in that category. We're going to bump you to the next one, which is for like people who are less sort of impaired than we think you are. And he talks about this. He made an Instagram video where he talks about what that meeting was like, what they said to him. Basically, he says that they told him that they would rather disadvantage him than disadvantage the whole rest of the category because he's too good. And I think that is exactly what we're talking about, right? This idea of like, well, but who is being disadvantaged? What does disadvantage mean?
Well, like, does like Michael Jordan have to play in his own league now because he's too good for
Right.
you know what I mean? Like, that's like, it's
Totally.
interesting.
And it is, right? Like, it's all about, what you expect someone to be able to do, right? Which is what we're talking about with, the female category too. You say, these women, they're too fast. We don't expect you to be able to run that fast. And so there must be something going on here. And so we're going to change the rules now for you individually because we are trying to kind of quote unquote level the playing field. And I think that is sort of, you see it in the Paralympics. You see people sometimes complaining that certain athletes are classified incorrectly. You also sometimes see athletes choosing to compete up a category, basically, because they don't have enough competition in their classification. And if you've ever competed in sports, you know that, like, if you don't have anybody who's pushing you, right? If you don't have anybody who's around your same level or hopefully a little bit better, it's really hard to get better. It's hard to improve, right? This is why all elite athletes have training partners who are like ideally slightly better than them, right? Because then they can really get pushed. And so there's some swimmers, for example, who compete up a category because there's just nobody in their classification who is pushing them. And I just find that all so fascinating. And it allows us to really slice and dice what we mean by advantage and what advantage actually means and how we care about fairness in this very granular kind of way.
I also thought it was really interesting that there are so many athletes who are advocating for a more open classification less style, at least in some of the events, and that the athletes themselves, and we're not talking about just like the people who are dominating, right? It's not like people want that competition, and it's taking what the athletes themselves want alongside what people who aren't participating in the Paralympics, who may or may not be disabled themselves, what they decide, like what they think would create a more equitable playing field, right? Like, it's just this really interesting contrast.
Yeah, well, right. And so I started hearing murmurings about this years ago when I was doing that reporting on these like fancy prosthetic legs, as people were sort of saying like, well, like Scout Bassett and other, Paralympians were saying, well, what if we rethink this classification system? And this year, Hunter Woodhall, who is the one of this sort of duo, his wife Tara, they're very good on Instagram. They're very fun. If you like sort of following fun couples who love to support each other, they are like very much in that realm. And they seem very sweet. She won gold at the Olympics in the long jump, and he won gold in the 400 meter at the Paralympics in his classification. And they're very sweet. They're in love. It's great. But he said they actually, at the USA Track and Field Trials, they did a couple of these sort of what they call universal races, which is basically that it's just based on time. If you run between this time and this time, you can race in this race. And so you had 2 visually impaired athletes. You had athletes with cerebral palsy. You had amputees or people who run on prosthetics, right? And you had all of them racing together, and they all finished within a second of each other in many of the heats. Hunter afterwards gave an interview where he talked about like, this is what we need. We should be thinking about classifying people and grouping people by performance and not by whatever impairment it is. Because when you really think about it, there are some things where it's very obvious. Like, okay, like someone in a wheelchair should not be competing against someone who's trying to run on some legs or blades or whatever it is, right? Like wheels are a different situation, right? We're like not talking about that.
Wheels work differently.
Wheels work differently. But like, what is the actual performance advantage when you think about someone who is blind versus somebody who is running on prosthetics? Does one person have a true advantage over another person? Like, and what would it be and how would we know? For me, it makes me think about, we talked earlier about this like hypothetical, right? We talked about like, this hypothetical army of like athletes who are going to come and dominate or whatever. And in some ways, the Paralympics are sort of similarly thinking about are we starting from the end point? Are we starting from what is the time and how fast can you actually run? Or are we starting from the assumption of how fast you should be able to run? And that's what we're doing. The way it works now is the latter. The assumption that if you are in T64, you should be able to run about this fast. And if you are in T63, you should be able to run this fast. And if you run too fast in T63, you should be moved to T64, right? Or should we be thinking about it from how fast are you? And should you just run in a group with people who are about as fast as you? And I think that's a really interesting reframing of the way we think about categories, because it doesn't start from the biological. It doesn't start from the individual person and what they may or may not be able to do, or what their body may or may not be configured for. It starts from how fast can you run? How fast can you swim? And I think that's really interesting.
It brings to mind a word that we don't use anymore, which is handicapped, right? And how we used to think of a disability as a way that you had a handicap, which in golf, right, is like the number of points that you are given, like quantifying what you are not able to do. And it strikes me again, too, that like so much of this conversation is panic in a world where we are trying to quantify and know everything, that there are things that are unknowable, that are
and that's the joy of
that,
sports.
I know, and of life, right?
It's true. That's the thing. Like, I don't know. I know that there are some people, and people who I know, who I are friends with, who love like the quant stuff. They love the stats. They love all that. But like, the thing that is magical about sports, and as you say, life, is the moments where someone does something that you don't expect, that shouldn't work, right? Like that shouldn't happen. Usain Bolt. When he first comes onto the scene, everyone's like, no way. He's too tall. He's too big. Like, he doesn't have whatever. And he's the greatest sprinter to have ever sprinted. Male sprinter. I just feel like that's the thing that's so magical, is when someone like turns and makes a shot that they should not have any right to make, right? Like, that's the stuff that like you watch people who do things, but you're like, how did you do that? Like Marta, iconic soccer player. You watch her and you're like, how did you do that? How did you do that? That should not be possible. You shouldn't be able to do that. And that's the thing that is so amazing about watching sports. And I feel like so much of this conversation just loses that magic of that excitement and that joy of watching people break records or do things that are just, I don't know, unreal. And that's why we watch sports. I don't watch sports because I care about like the vaginal configuration of the athletes. Like, that's not why I'm watching, right? Like, I mean, there may be some men for which that's why they're watching, and those people should think about their lives. But you know what I mean? I just feel like it just, people get so lost in these conversations that they forget like what the joy of sports are all about. I don't know. That's my rant about this.
Yeah, no. And that answers what I was going to have to be my last question, which is, what do you want the listeners of Tested to like think about as they walk away from the show? And like, that's part of it. But if there's other things that you want to talk about too.
Yeah. I mean, I do think, right, like so much of this, I mean, there are some people who are like, I don't care about sports. Like, I don't like sports. And that's fine, right? Like, there are things I don't care about, right? Like, whatever. But I do think that sometimes, especially when we get into conversations around like, the inclusion of trans women in sports, and again, it's only ever women. People don't care if trans men compete, right? Because the assumption is that they couldn't possibly be good because they're actually secretly women, and women are bad at sports. It just feels like this moment of like, are you watching sports because you love sports, or are you watching sports because you are secretly a cop in your mind and you want to like, you love rules and you want to like police people? Because if that's the case, then like, I don't know, like, I feel like you're not enjoying sports that much, right? And I want to watch people do what they love and do it well. And I don't really care, right, if what their body is or isn't like. And so I think that that's one thing. But the other thing for Tested in particular, I think my biggest goal for the show, just because I knew that the show was never going to force, World Athletics to change their policies, right? They have committed so many resources. They've gone to international court. They've been, they've committed to this. But so my real goal was to really try and help people have hard conversations about this when things come up. And I think it is often confusing. And if you're new to it, you're just like, I don't know, like, do they have an advantage? It's hard. Right. There's a lot of muddied water, intentionally so. But also to sort of remember that it's so easy sometimes in these conversations to get really hypothetical and really philosophical about sort of the nature of sports and the future. But just to kind of remember that these are real human beings whose lives are being impacted. And I wanted people to just meet these women and get to know them a little bit. And so that next time there is a sort of debate that can get sort of abstract, to remember like Christine or Max or Annette or these women who, are very much not abstract, right? They're very real, and they're just trying to do what they love. They're just trying to do what every other woman gets to do, which is show up at the track and compete, and they're not allowed to do that. And I think that, I don't want to say humanize because they're already humans. They don't need me to humanize them, but to kind of introduce people to these women so that when there are these conversations, you're thinking of someone in particular, which I think actually really does help have a more sort of thoughtful place, or helps land in a more thoughtful place, as opposed to just kind of like fairness or like, these sort of really big picture conversations.
Rose, this has been such a delight. Absolutely exceeded my
having
greatest
me.
expectations.
Oh, this is so fun. I'm so excited.
Where else can people find you on the internet if they want to find more from you?
So Tested has a website, tested-podcast.com, which has a ton of resources, a bunch of like blog posts, some essays, some additional stuff, and will continue to be updated. We also have a newsletter, which will also continue to be updated. If you listen to the show, it sort of ends on like a little bit of a cliffhanger around a court case, and there will be updates on that case coming soon. We also have next week, our newsletter is about a really interesting new legal challenge that is happening that I think is really fascinating. So sort of continuing to cover this story and sort of what's going on. I am mostly off the social media right now because I'm learning to weld and doing other things. But I'm basically just Rose Eveleth. I'm the only Rose Eveleth that exists in the world. So if you Google me for better or for worse, it's going to be me. I can't hide anything. And also, like, it's very easy to find. But yes, mostly I'm off of the internet. So I deleted Instagram from my phone, which is very exciting for me personally. And so I'm just trying to kind of like, do my weird art projects and take a little break after Tested. But the Tested newsletter is the place to learn more about what's going on this particular topic.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I'm such a fan, so I'm so excited to have been able to talk to you.
Thanks for listening to the Culture Study Podcast. For today's episode, paid subscribers get a bonus discussion on feminism and motherhood and work. Totally simple stuff to grapple with. But Melody and I are going to talk about it, and that's all thanks to a great question submitted for Ask Ann Anything. If you want to hear it, head to culturestudypod.substack.com and become a paid subscriber today. And whether or not you chip in, be sure to actually subscribe to this show, like in your podcast app, wherever and however you get your podcasts. We have so many great episodes in the works, and I promise you don't want to miss any of them. And if you want to suggest a topic or ask a question about the culture that surrounds you, or submit a question for our subscriber-only advice time segment, go to our Google form at tinyurl.com/culturestudypod, or check the show notes for a link. We are going to start planning our new year very soon, and we need new episode ideas. So that's where you can submit them. We want to hear everything. The Culture Study Podcast is produced by me, Anne Helen Peterson, and Melody Rowell. Our music is by Poddington Bear. You can find me on Instagram at Anne Helen Peterson, Melody at Melodious47, and the show at Culture Study Pod.